All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our last webinar in our three-part series on graphs, fraud detection, and AI. In our past two webinars, we dove into the business impact of graphs and fraud applications and explored the nitty-gritty of the technology behind a successful fraud app. Now, in today's session, we'll cover an easy-to-use playbook for getting your fraud application funded. Joining us today, we have Rick Van Bruggen, Regional VP and General Advocate for Neo4j, and Scott Heath, Graph Practice Lead at Expero. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We invite you to submit any questions you have throughout the presentation using the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer as many as possible live at the end of the presentation. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be made available to you along with the slides after the presentation. And finally, as mentioned before, this is the last webinar in a three-part series. If you're interested in watching the previous two webinars, you can find those along with any of our previously recorded webinars at neo4j.com/webinars. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Rick and Scott. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Greta. Hi, everyone. My name is Rick Van Bruggen from Neo4j, and a warm welcome from me as well. It's a bit of a complicated setup today. We've got three people in the three different locations doing the presentation, but we'll manage. Technology will help us, right? And so myself, just a short introduction. I've been with Neo4j for 5.5 years, almost 6 years actually. Mostly on the commercial side, but I've been trying to help our customers and now our commercial team here in Europe to basically get more value from the wonderful world of graphs. And Scott is joining me today, one of our partners in the US. Scott, you can probably introduce yourself a little bit later. He's a graph practice manager at Expero, and we'll be guiding you through this little journey here to help you lock down funding on these graph solutions. If you guys don't know Neo4j yet, then you probably should take a quick look at our website. Neo4j, we have every right, I think, to call ourselves the graph company. Been around for a very long time. Been working in the wonderful world of graphs for more than 15 years these days, actually. So we've built out a fantastic company with more than 200 employees based in Silicon Valley, but we have large offices in London, Munich, Paris, and Malmö, Sweden. Well-funded, lots of enterprise subscription customers. As you can see from this little slide here, really a market leader in this space. Scott, maybe you want to introduce Expero for a couple of minutes, yeah?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Scott Heath. I was one of our tour guides in the previous backgrounds. I've got about 20 years of software development experience. In the old days, we used to call it ERP and off-the-shelf software in today's graph world. And really, Expero is in the business of solving big, hard problems that graph has really become. And so if you look at our background, we really focus on the full life cycle. And today, we're going to talk about how to get those funded. But most of these things started with whether it's one person who was technical, one person that was a business user that could see the light, if you will. It was how to get that vision, if you will. In some cases, how do I get money for that, and how do I go forward and use great technology like Neo4j to go solve this big business problem? And that's a little bit about myself and Expero. And in this slide, I think what we want to do today is really sort of culminate the first two, which was solve the business problem. In this case, is fraud. Could easily be customer 360 or supply chain or any other problem, but fraud is kind of how we got started here. And we know that your world is messy, and all of the projects we typically we do together with Neo and Expero is that you have a lot of information, data in those other systems, and then ultimately using the power of graph and machine learning, as we've learned, in addition to building these applications for people at the end user. But really, that's really what we're trying to do here today, and ultimately in this whole process is bring to you this good news that you can solve it specifically with graph and in your world today. Like you heard Greta tell us, we've got two other ones that are online. And so certainly come join us online. We've got lots of, between Neo4j and Expero, we've got lots of content on our websites and in our different blogs, et cetera. So don't feel like you're alone. And we know that this can be a little tricky in how we do it. So certainly reach out and find some information. And with that, I'll throw it back to you, Rick.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Scott. And what we'll do now is basically spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about business cases for these advanced applications around fraud detection or any other graph-enhanced application that you guys want to be building there, right? And we've kind of split this into two parts. The first part being why we need to build a business case for graphs. And then the second part, which is what Scott is going to be tackling, is how you build it. Why do we need a business case for graph? And this kind of seems obvious, but to be honest, in any high-tech project, in any graph project, in any graph-enhanced fraud solution, whatever you want to call it, this is the most obvious mistake that people make. We tend to see this in time and time again. That people know that they need to build this business case, but they simply don't put enough effort into it. If you don't have a strong case for these types of solutions, if you don't think through all of the implications, all of the parties involved, all of the stakeholders that are going to be affected by these solutions, you really tend to do a lot of work, do a lot of effort, spend a lot of effort in this, and end up without a solution, basically. This is a real problem, and this is a real problem that I see time and time again with people that are trying to adopt graph solutions. And I kind of relate this back to a wonderful book that I would recommend to anyone. It's on the top right corner of this slide here, by Mark T. Miller, called Selling is Dead. And you might think that this is a sales book, but it really isn't. It's basically an explanation on how technologists adopt new technologies, new disruptive, divergent technologies, right? And graph-based fraud solutions, guess what? They are divergent solutions. Now, what is that? What is a divergent solution? Well, let me share a little personal story with you. And if you see this beautiful little car here, right? And I don't know if there's any Europeans on this webinar, but this is it's not the actual picture of my first car, but it's exactly the same car. It's the car that I bought in 1993 when I was still in college, and this is an Opel Corsa, a little diesel engine, very, very lightweight car. Cost me like 3,000 euros at the time, not that much money. But to be honest, it took me more than 6 months to make a decision on this car. It took me a long time to make up my mind, not just because 3,000 euros was a lot of money for me at the time, but because this thing was something that I had never bought before, right? It was something completely different. And this is very relevant to what we're experiencing today when people are adopting or buying into graph-based solutions here, right? Why? Because essentially the decision-making process for divergent and convergent technologies is completely different. A convergent technology is something that you've bought before. It's something where you understand your requirements, you understand your evaluation criteria, and you know what you need to expect. Right? This is an environment where you have a lot more certainty, right? You know exactly what you're going to be buying, right? So you know what you're looking for, and there's a lot more certainty here. Divergent solutions, which is what graph-based solutions are, and especially graph-based fraud solutions, is something new. It's something that you have never bought before. It's like that little car of mine that I was buying in 1993. Right? You may not fully understand it. You don't know how to evaluate it. You don't know how to compare it to something else. You don't know what to expect. You have uncertainty, right? And I want to stress that the way people deal with decision making under circumstances of uncertainty is something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about business cases, right? If you go to the next slide, Scott, then you'll see that this is not something mythical or something imaginary. This is something that has been a subject of fundamental behavioral research for the past 25 years, or even longer. Kahneman and Tversky. If everyone, maybe you've heard of these guys, these are Nobel Prize winning behavioral scientists, and they basically modeled and made us understand how human beings make decisions under uncertainty. How human beings are going to make decisions when they buy divergent technologies. And if you advance one more slide, one more click there, Scott, then you'll see me refer to something that these guys invented, which is what we call prospect theory. Prospect theory. If there's something that I want you to Google after this webinar, this is it, right? It's about how humans make decisions under uncertainty. And I'd like to, illustrate what prospect theory means by sharing a short experiment with you, right? Here's two choices, right? What would you choose? A 95% of winning, 95% chance of winning $10,000, or 100% chance to win $9,499. That's an easy choice, right? You would always pick the 100% chance, right? What would you choose? A 95% chance to lose $10,000 or 100% chance to lose $9,499, right? You would pick the 95% chance, right? Because maybe there's 5% that you wouldn't lose anything, right? This is fundamental. This is fundamental. This is prospect theory in a nutshell. When people make decisions under uncertainty, right, they will undervalue uncertain rewards, right? So you will choose the lower reward, right, the 9,499, right? And you will choose the higher loss, the $10,000 loss, the 95% of the $10,000 loss, right? So this is the fundamental thing in prospect theory. When you evaluate investments, when you evaluate whether or not you're going to be doing this graph project, right, under circumstances of uncertainty, you will choose the lower rewards and choose the higher losses. Why is that important? Well, this is important because if you go to the next slide, Scott, when we apply prospect theory to divergent technology, that means that we're going to be looking at two sides of an equation, right? We're going at looking at, roughly speaking, and I'm simplifying here, at three decision factors. First factor is going to be that you're going to try to understand the value, the rewards, right, of this project that you're evaluating, right? It's not just the absolute value, it's the perception of value, right? That's most important. Secondly, you're going to be looking at the other side of the equation, which is the perception of risk, the losses, right? Plus the costs, right? The third factor. The third factor is the costs, the losses as well. So you're constantly going to be evaluating whether the perception of value, right, the rewards, which you're always going to be underestimating in circumstances of uncertainty, right, or the losses, which you're always going to overvalue in circumstances of uncertainty, which one of these is going to be bigger, right? This is the evaluation that you will make. This is the comparison that people will make. Is the perception of value going to be larger than the perception of risk plus the costs, right? Now, if you go to the next slide, there's an important thing here, right? If we are going to make a decision around divergent technologies, we need to make sure that we influence this equation and that we make the perception of value much bigger than the perception of risk plus the costs. They have to be clear. That equation has to be a lot bigger. If that doesn't happen, guess what's going to happen? And it happens all the time to tech projects and to graph projects as well. People are going to stick with what they know. They're going to stick with their current environment, and they're going to choose not to decide, right? So why am I spending so much time on this? When I say that why we need to create business cases for graph projects is because we need to influence this equation. We need to influence the P factor, first of all, right? The P factor is all about perception, right? And humans are all about perception. We can influence perception. We can make people feel more comfortable. We can make people see the value, right? How we influence this perception is very specific to every single customer, right? It's going to be very, very customer specific, project specific, right? But in case of business decisions, it's very clear that we need to take the uncertainty, the perception factor out of the equation by adding more quantitative, objective, not so much subject to interpretation data points, right? That's how we're going to influence the equation, right? And that's how we're going to make sure that we don't get into a situation where all of us do lots and lots of work and we end up with a project that is going nowhere, right? So how do we do that? How do we influence the equation? Lots of different possibilities, right? But we need to look for quantitative data around response times, around speed, around the number of servers that we need, the number of cores that we need, a number of people that are going to be involved, the number of man days that we spend on a project, all of these things, but make it quantitative. By making it quantitative, we are going to influence the perception of value. Same thing for the perception of risk, right? We're going to have to make that obvious. We're going to have to make that clear to the client that, you know, there are so many references out there. We have done this before. We have piloted before. We have reference customers. We have all of these things that will lower the perception of risk, right? And this is how we can do that, right? We have to create these business cases. We have to assure that we make these business cases in order to make people adopt these types of graph solutions. And that's a very key thing. This is why we need to do that. Now, I'd like to hand back over to Scott, because now we're going to talk a little bit about how you do that, right? We know why we need to do it. Now, how do we do that? So, Scott, why don't you take it away?
You bet. So what Rick's done is paint a wonderful picture of what it's going to take. Now, those of you who can't see your hands raised out there in the virtual world, those of you that are in the IT section versus in the business, or in some cases, we have people that ride as liaisons in between the two. The ultimate goal here is what I'm about to share with you is a nice checklist. It certainly makes logical sense. It is the attempt now to start to write things down, create a spreadsheet, if you will, and ultimately get us to the end zone, which is to start to show that perception of value and risk and cost. The biggest thing that I would recommend is that this is not a follow all 6 steps. There may be follow steps 1 and 2 and go back and redo them as you talk with your business users and your technology users. But ultimately, what I've got here for you is, you know, our first step is why are you here? What is it on the left and up in the upper corner for the business? Is, are we trying to cut costs or drive revenue? Are we trying to improve the fraud recognition, cut time to response? What are those things for your company? If you're a credit card company, they're going to be different than if you're a bank, and if you're a specialty service company, et cetera. So in this context, how do we use this fraud for your business? Well, I don't know you personally yet, but certainly look forward to that. But you need to ask those questions whether you're in the technical or the business sector. Then the second component is those same questions that you're asking of the business. What are their technical cohorts? So why are we making a technical change? Is it speed? Is it adoption? Is it cost? Is it time, etc. And then finally, our users are at the bottom, which is, are you trying to increase your end customer goal? Are you trying to avoid things, etc.? All of these now filter into our checklist. And what we can see here, and we're going to spend quite an amount of time on this, is ultimately it's very straightforward. You're going to look at what's happening today based on what we just talked about for your motivations are. Then you're going to look at how graph potentially fits into the future state. Then we're going to try and create some math. We're going to try and run some calculations, as Rick mentioned, for cost and perceptive cost. We're going to use the term soft return on investment or hard return on investment for today. Your company may have a different vocabulary. Ultimately, we have to share this with stakeholders. So whether it's executives or senior executives or management, we've got to get feedback across the aisle, if you will. And then some of you may care about what your competition is doing. Some of you may care very, very dearly what your competition is doing, and some of you may not. And then ultimately, we're going to put those together, and we're going to try and put it in a language, whether it's in PowerPoint or Microsoft Word or Google or whatever that is. We're going to try and do, as I refer to, big animal pictures to do that. And all of that now gives us this recipe for our business case. So let's get specific. When we talk about the first step in our journey here, it's how do we start to look at the current state? So as you heard me mention specifically with fraud, now you need to get specific with your business customer, or if you're in the business, you need to get specific with your technology partner. And that is, are you losing revenue? Are you worried about a frozen credit card where a customer is trying to charge it and they can't use it, and that customer ends up getting mad and then leaves you? What are those focused specific problems? Because as you start to identify those, specifically if we identify churn, then we can start to hone in on how much, whether it's cost are we losing for churn, how much time are we spending on supporting the churn of that customer, or another use case line item could be that idea of analytics on a potential fraud case. Am I spending $2 to investigate a 50-cent fraud case? Am I spending $10 that ultimately gets that customer unhappy, that gets them to churn? So it's this cascading set of events, but what we're looking for here is how do we start to put our hands around those kinds of things? And that's our first step. And some of these may be, whether they are anecdotes, you ultimately want to get to hard cases of what those look like. And these now cross several different business categories. You heard me talk about what's typically called the front office or sales. There may be a finance or a back office. So again, whether the fraud is coming from multiple systems, in many cases we've seen where analysts are having to pull records from 5 or 10 different systems, and it's a nightmare. It takes days for those reports to come back. There's no integrated view of that as an entity relationship, much less being able to use a graph to be able to view that type of a thing. And so there are dollars and things that are spent that way. The other item then is how many audits happen for fraud, how many internal audits, external audits, those kinds of things. All of those things have impacts monetarily. And if we can start to identify what those look like today in our view, now we can start to get tangible. And then ultimately, IT and support. So now is IT supporting an ever-changing technology query? In some cases, that's the hardest ROI for the IT group, is this sort of never-ending constant barrage of SQL queries that just stack up with hours and time and very expensive resources that may turn into, whether it's a platform, et cetera. And in some cases, you're carrying older technologies along that are doing what you could do in graph, but they're very expensive and time consuming. And ultimately, that's what we're looking for now, is starting to line item what each of those look like. And that's ultimately our goal, to try and do those kinds of things. So here we go. Now what we try and do then is try and take that cost of freezing a credit card. Let's see what that looks like in 12 months or 6 months. In this case, we're spending $2,000. We may freeze that, right? And what happens now is we have this 2,000 per incident times the 2,000 that happen. And so what we start to get then is, perhaps with our new graph system, we might be able to see a reduction of $800,000. we're trying to put a mathematical line item together. And again, your size and your corporation may vary. And ultimately, that's what we try and do then is build this very specific line item list, whether it's a soft, as we heard here, which is perception of what cost might be, or a hard one, which means that I know today I have 20 analysts that spend 20 hours a piece, and we have 2,000 of these that come in to our call center for fraud. That is considered a hard one. And you can see here customer satisfaction, that in your organization, that may be a hard cost. We may know what that customer satisfaction equals in churn or what their average per card spend is. You may see down here, obviously churn is hard. Switching, this constant then of the actual total dollars that were lost in fraud are typically known values. And again, what we're looking for now is we're building a scorecard. So that's where we're going now, is we built this scorecard. The other sort of example here then is you start to empathize with whether it's a financial analyst. In some cases, it may be a call center representative, it may be a manager. It starts to identify by category what these individuals are doing, whether it's the front office, the sales rep, the sales time, marketing effort, etc. It's this long punch list that we can start to aggregate for what those things look like. Okay, so that's our current state. Now we start thinking about the future state. This is where we start saying, well, if we had the dashboard for our persona, who could be an analyst, what we now want to do then is, what are the new projected changes? A tip for everyone here is that when you're putting together your ROI, you don't want to say, ooh, this thing is going to be 100% change, because many have come before you, and chances are that typically your business or counterparts in the executive are looking for a 10% kind of a gain. In many cases is an incredible gain. 15% may be fantastic. 30% maybe, the max that you can ever get to. But again, now when we're looking at this future state, is whether it's using, as we heard in the second webinar, the machine learning, this value mapping to build, let's say, a visualization of a graph that allows you to go in and see this in less than 10 minutes to be able to go find that fraudster in graph. What are the potential new paradigms that these things are bringing to the equation? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do then, is look at our as is or current state against what our future state is, and say, well, if we think we're spending too much time for analysts doing hard reports, how much time could we save by using a new graph application? That's where we're starting to look at perhaps 30% as our change number. But again, we're mapping this current state to the future state. And now we may have some platform considerations as well. And some of you may know that you have an on-premise solution. It may be an Oracle or SAP. We may not necessarily sunset those systems, but the new application may have some impacts of whether you do it in the cloud or you do it on-premise. You may get some gains here. In some cases, it may be a wash, but now we're looking at sort of that category of the platform for what that future platform is versus what you're doing today. In some cases, our customers identify one or two license elements that they may be using in older SQL databases that they can, quite frankly, turn off, and our graph technology may actually just take the place of that, and it may be a zero line item, but it's certainly not an uptick. The second one is now, again, something called total cost of ownership. This is many times this payback, and we'll see here in a minute. I've actually got a spreadsheet to show you what that looks like, but that's really sort of getting at the heart of this on our technology and across the board for all of our technology. And this starts to look at two categories that we'll see in our spreadsheet. A one-time cost, which means that our first time that we set up a graph infrastructure, we may spend some dollars to set it up. We may actually create some new visualizations, whether it's with internal resources or external resources, this application or implementation, but yet at the same time, we're having the first year a big pop in stopping fraud with graph, and it may be larger than that. And then over the years, you want to make sure then that you look at what those recurring costs are. They may not be as big as the first year, so we want to look at this future state now going forward. So year one is typically larger, both in the spend as well as potentially the the savings, and then year over year, there's typically a dollar amount that we're saving as we go forward. And the key is in those different categories we mentioned about is to make sure what those look like. Okay, so now that we have our future state, right, we have that in our hands and we have our current state, let's start to do some math. And so many times people ask me, why would I want to monetize this now when I see coming up that I want to go talk to my stakeholders? A quick tip is in my 20 years of doing this, what I find is when I go forward to a business user group, or in some cases an executive group, having something that looks like we have some basis to have that conversation goes an incredible distance. So the fact that we've created a light ROI calculation, we've looked at some of the business benefactors, we've looked at some of the technology savings, if you will, to go do those things. And so this step many times will be done repetitiously. We may do this one time, we may go back to our stakeholders, they may say, you know, you were mostly right, but let's tune it up this way, which actually begets a very important element here, which is knowing, number one, your organization and being able to have an open dialogue that we'll see here with our stakeholders in a minute. But ultimately now, what we're trying to do then is let's try and take those line items we came up with in the current state and this percent change or savings that we came up in the future state. And now let's look at, again, whether it's each one of these line items, let's take those soft and hard dollar ones, because when we talk to our stakeholders, they may agree with our hard dollar ones and they may sort of frown at the soft dollar ones. But the key is we want to try and get them both in our spreadsheet. And how do we do this? What you can see here in the background is that I actually have a spreadsheet. Whether you use the spreadsheet that we use, I'm sorry, let me switch over here. Oops. Let me bring up my spreadsheet here. Pausing screen share. Okay, we'll come back to that here in a second. At the end here, we'll switch over and show you the demo of what that looks like. Our next one now is let's go see our stakeholders to go do that. And as I mentioned now, if I come in with at least a high-level spreadsheet, or even if it's a PowerPoint, typically, and many of you are probably laughing, which is they're not going to have the same project vision that you do, but that's okay. What you may want to do then is share your beginnings of an ROI or the focus points, because they may indeed come back and say, well, no, the cost that we spend on the fraud analysis is really not the heavy part. It's actually the fact that we spend $10 on trying to get that customer back to a happy place if we inadvertently cut their credit card off. And they may give you some better points, if you will, for what that is. There also may be a different technology view, et cetera. But again, our goal here is to get these team representatives together. Let's share where we're going with this business case and the business vision, and let's try and pick that aligned group vision. And in this case, what we try and show then is we can do some things ahead of time. We might do a quick survey. We may do a half day or a 2-hour kind of a foundational stakeholder workshop. We may try and do some iterations of these. But again, the conversation is actually more important than perhaps the spreadsheet and what the preconceived notions are. Is once you get those stakeholders involved, you can potentially have a much, much more powerful business case. The next step then is what do we do about what our competitors are doing? In this case, we may be in the industry of credit cards. We may be in the industry of fraud prevention. At some level, you need to know what the rest of the world is up to. And again, how does it apply to this? It really depends on what it is you're doing and specifically where you're going, which leads us to the second one then, is what are you trying to do? What were those goals? What are the top 3 things that your corporation is ultimately trying to do? And how does that impact your competitors? How are they doing it today? Are they using graph? Are they being more insightful by doing a category of things? Are they showing graph to the customer, letting the customer do their own analysis inside of their applications? The other thing then is just quite frankly being aware of what's going out there. Today, if you read up on it, graph is just about everywhere. Neo4j and Expero are leading the tip of that spear, but it's not just us. The market is dictating that this technology is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. And how is your competition adopting it, and does that motivate perhaps your business case? The other one then is, what are your customers saying about you? Are there other ways that you can see those kinds of things? And what you might find is you can do your own ranking of your competition. You can look at whether it's social ranking. Again, for those of you that are in the banking industry, the financial services, et cetera, are people switching? Do they like your product? Do they find it more usable? Is there some overall scoring that you can do? In many cases, the answer is yes. The other thing is something that we call a hidden competition. There are products called G2 Crowd, which you may not even know about, where your users are logging on and quite frankly are showing your product at a lower level that you didn't even know about. And so I would say today, be very aware of what your competitive products are, and is fraud, in this case, leading to a low score and satisfaction for what those are. So now that we've done this sort of 360, if you will, for our business case, let's come back now and start to prepare. We started off this discussion where we looked at what was driving us. We looked at what the competitive and technical landscape was. And then we've looked at now, what are our users trying to do? We believe we have most of the items that we talked about today, right? And so what we want to be able to do now is actually start to bring it together. The way we do this typically is in a PowerPoint. Your organization may actually have business case PowerPoints. They may have calculations that they recommend or not. In many cases, you kind of are on your own. That's okay. You typically use these 4 or 5 sections that I've outlined, and you can typically lay out a very good, concise type of one. The other thing that we're coming in here is it cost avoidance. Are we trying to drive revenue? Are we trying to save cost in what we're doing on a day-to-day or manpower? And ultimately making sure that we highlight those as we go through that. The next question then is, as we start to put these together with the internal company KPIs, is do you have your user council? Have they been involved in the building of this compilation and presentation? Typically, if it's a cold boot, you just don't know when you get into that big executive meeting. If you've been able to one-off in the hall, get some information or some anecdotes, many times it goes a fair distance. And quite frankly, if you can sit down and interact face-to-face as part of this process, many people want to save money. They want to do the company right thing, and so that's typically a good thing. But what happens when that's not enough? What happens when we get to the point now where that looks good? Scott, it looks like we're going to save $20 million. My company is scratching their head, and as Rick has said, it's not enough to move the needle. One of the things we have in our toolkits is a working prototype. Working prototype can mean a couple of different categories, but if we take 1 or 2 of these items that we've listed, in one case it may be spend less time analyzing a potential fraud incident. We can insert that into that. We can say what happens in the future state if we have a graph prototype. The answer is it can now find fraud in less than 2 hours. We believe that that alone, that one little tiny line item, may be a $5 million category of those kinds of things. We can point to, let's say, one of those different elements in our monetization, and our stakeholder has said, if you show me this one thing, then let's go do it. And that's where we take a play out of our playbook. Would a prototype help to do this? In many cases, you may say, absolutely. I don't recommend, and we typically don't recommend going too big, but pick a time frame, whether it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks. Expero and Neo4j typically do these things in the 4 to 6 time frame. We may pick 1, maybe 2 use cases, wouldn't get too crazy with it. And that's where we then take that individual line item, let's load some data. And the key in a graph prototype is that we use the data while we're building this use case, because the data is very different. In some cases, you may be asking, can we do it with this size of data? These are all very important aspects of why this playbook works. And then ultimately, when the stakeholders start to see that screen that shows the graph, shows the machine learning type of a thing, and then shows what the risk is, many times a lot of those barriers come down. Some of those other prefects that you had in your spreadsheet will start to come to be crisper in focus, because I can actually show now a specific example of what that looks like, not just in the spreadsheet. Then we start to look at what kind of prototype. We can do simple things, which is a simple diagram. You can use the Neo4j product. You can load up a quick data set. You can start to look at those data elements and start to look at that. In some cases, you might need a little bit more of a visual concept. You might need to show the end user of what their dashboard might look like. And we can do this in either low fidelity or high fidelity when it talks to the customer. And many times in our process, we may do this prototype. We may go back again with how we do our funding category. We may go find some additional costs in future, et cetera, that ultimately come back to the big user. We start to use some of our concepts of graph. What we do here now is we start to look at some of these dependencies. And whether it's similarity or flow or centrality. And again, the goal in this prototype is to really sort of hit home with our end users what it is that they're trying to do. And with that, we come to our time here. If you'd like to, as I apologize for not being able to show you a live spreadsheet, there's no magic in the spreadsheet. It simply shows each line item that we discussed today. Certainly, we can follow up with you if you're interested to do that, or you can build your own. But the takeaway here now is Neo4j and Expero are focused on trying to solve whether it's this fraud solution or really the customer problem. And our goal here with this how to build your business case is to give you a couple more bullets in your gun, if you will, to make that your vision turn into a project. And with that, I'll throw it back over for questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, attendees, now's the time. If you have any questions, go ahead and type those into the questions portion of your GoToWebinar control panel. While you're doing that, I just want to remind you that the previous two webinars, they're up on our website at neo4j.com/webinars, so you can take a look at those if you're interested in more of the business case or technology sides of building fraud applications with graphs. All right, so let's dive into the questions. All right, so what's the biggest mistake that you've seen people make when it comes to creating a business case for graph solutions?
Should I take that, Greta?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Yep, okay. Well, biggest mistake, that's a good one. So many. But I guess when you think back to my earlier story around influencing the equation around the perception of value as compared to the perception of risk plus the costs. I guess the most obvious mistake that people and most frequent mistake that people make is that they don't make those data points quantitative enough. Right. So when you're trying to influence perceptions, right, when you're trying to make people understand, what the value is or what the risks are exactly, the way to influence that is to really make those data points quantitative. Right. Don't talk about fluffiness, or don't only talk about fluffy, untangible factors, but make sure that you have enough tangible, quantitative factors to reinforce your business case. I'm not saying that untangible items are or qualitative items are unimportant. On the contrary, right? But you have to have quantitative elements as well, because that's the way you influence these perceptions most effectively.
And Rick, I'll put a real life case element on that, which is the ability to speak directly to a user who might be in the call center group or someone who's in the fraud analysis team. They will typically give you a tangible answer. If we could do this one thing, it could save us this many dollars, and a screen could help us 20% of what that is. So very much what Rick is saying is drawing a line then to the people who know the information. Don't be afraid to approach them in this process, because that's how you really do the right thing in the process.
Great. Okay, Scott, we have one for you. So obviously understand that Neo4j is the graph database portion of this solution, but do you want to talk a little bit about kind of where, when, and how to get Expero involved in your business decisions?
Absolutely. So in the first diagram that we saw way at the very beginning was that Expero helps our customers really where the rubber meets the road. So how do I get data out of the systems that I have today? How do I integrate it and do wonderful things with graph? Neo4j then is obviously the leading graph engine. And then we also build visualizations that sort of normal humans have to use that may use the machine learning or have these dashboards that speak to that. And so that's why if you engage Expero, we can typically talk about this big picture both from a technology layer and then from a business and use case perspective. And that's kind of how we fit in the model.
And I think you may have covered this in the last couple of slides, but how long does that process normally take?
So when you look at a business case, depending on if you have a prototype, many times it goes right along with it. It can take 1 to 2 weeks,